Well, today we're going to look at the George W. Bush administration. Now, the year 2000 was a tumultuous year. The Democrats are going to turn to Al Gore. Al Gore had been vice president to Bill Clinton and had served by his side during the impeachment hearings. The Republicans are going to turn to George W. Bush. George W. Bush was the oldest son of former President George H.W. Bush. Both Bush and Gore will stress character during the election, and in the election, Bush is going to win a very narrow victory. Now, the victory itself came down to the state of Florida. Florida was a pivotal state. Whoever won Florida was going to win the presidency. And at first the news media said that it was won by Gore. Then they reversed themselves and said no, it was won by Bush. And by 2 o'clock in the morning it was obvious that Florida was too close to call. Well, of course, Florida's governor was Jeb Bush, brother of George W. and son of George H.W. And Jeb Bush declared that Florida had gone for Bush. However, Democrats disagree. The Florida vote was deadlocked. Now, Al Gore said that even though he had lost by a couple of thousand votes, he should have a recount, which Florida law allowed. And the recount was taken, and now instead of losing by a couple of thousand votes, Gore has lost by a couple of hundred votes. Florida allows for a second recount, although you have to pick your counties. And Gore is going to choose Dade County. That's where Miami is at. And Gore believes that the people had tried to vote for him, but their ballots did not reflect it. In those days you had punch cards, and if you didn't punch the hole hard enough with your pen, the part that was supposed to fall off the Chad did not. The Gore people went through Florida courts, and the Florida Supreme Court said that Gore should have a chance for the recount. The Bush people decided to go through U.S. courts, and eventually it came before the United States Supreme Court in a court case called Bush v. Gore.
We'll hear argument now in number 00949, George W. Bush and Richard Cheney versus Albert Gore et al.
On day 34 of the recount, the focus moved from Florida to Washington. Of course, no cameras were allowed, but the audio from the U.S. Supreme Court was released soon after Ted Olson began.
Mr. Chief Justice, thank you. May it please the court. We didn't know we would ever get to the Supreme Court pretty much until we got there. And we got there on two occasions, from two mischievous Florida Supreme Court decisions.
In my view, if we were stuck with the Florida Supreme Court, we were toast.
And with the case now in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, the Gore team faced a similar dilemma.
The problem, of course, is that this was a decision as to who was going to be president of the United States and who was going to appoint the next Supreme Court justices, something that people on the court had an interest in.
The Court of Chief Justice William Rehnquist consisted of 5 justices appointed by Republican presidents and 4 by Democratic presidents. Despite a feared political split, the court's first vote was unanimous. On December 1st, Bush lawyers argued that the, quote, arbitrary, standardless, and selective manual recounts threatened to overturn the certified results of an election they had won.
The United States Supreme Court, by 9-0 vote, said, basically, what are you doing? What are your standards down there? What's going on?
And the Florida Supreme Court never paid one bit of attention whatsoever to the direction from the United States Supreme Court.
On December 8th, the Bush team used the Florida court's lack of response to convince the U.S. Supreme Court to halt the recount. On Monday, December 11th, Ted Olson's argument was interrupted almost immediately.
Can you begin by telling us our federal jurisdiction? Where's the federal question here?
The federal question arises. The principle we kept emphasizing was there were rules about deadlines in the Florida Election Code. The Florida Supreme Court had changed those rules. So we said that's unconstitutional. It may not be the most powerful argument we bring to this
I
court.
think that's right.
It was apparent that justices had ideas of their own.
Well, and I thought your point was that the process is being conducted in violation of the Equal Protection Clause because it's standards.
He interrupted and asked about the Equal Protection Clause. I was very much ready for that question.
What, in your opinion, would be a fair standard?
The penetration of the ballot card would be required.
Equal protection, I don't think was anything that anybody was expecting to become the critical issue. The law in Florida said we're going to have votes counted not on whether the voter has technically followed all of the rules for marking the ballot, but can we discern the voter's intent?
The justices continued to focus on the punch cards, and Katherine Harris was again at the center.
My decision in this process has been made carefully.
And what standard did the Secretary of State set?
She had not set one. Not only was there not a standard, but there was a change 2 or 3 times during the course of this process.
Mr. Boyes, we'll hear from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. May it please the court.
David Boies began by defending the Florida court's rulings.
I think, Your Honor, and obviously this court and this Florida Supreme Court is the best interpreter of that opinion. And all this Florida Supreme Court did was to say to the canvassing boards, you've got to complete your job. You can't have your job interrupted by a riot. You can't have your job interrupted because Katherine Harris shuts the window. You've got to finish your job.
Well, why isn't the standard the one that voters are instructed to follow, for goodness sakes? I mean, it couldn't be clearer.
The justices continued to be concerned with the standards.
I think there must be a uniform standard. I think there is a uniform standard. The question is whether that standard is too general or not. I think
Could that vary from county to county?
I think it can vary from individual to individual.
So that even in one county could vary from table to table? I'm counting these ballots.
Now, there was a statewide standard. It was a subjective standard, was the intent of the voter. And what Justice Souter was looking for was, what's the objective standard that we can apply?
Thank you. The case is submitted.
Leaving court that day, the drama continued, as neither side was confident the end was near.
One doesn't know what the Supreme Court is going to do.
Every time I've made a prediction about what the last argument was, I've been proven wrong.
Clear news, balanced news now. You are looking live.
After 35 days of confusion and legal complexity, the night of December 12, 2000 was reminiscent of election night.
If in fact the standard has changed, they may have to go back and recount some votes that had previously been counted.
Again, in the rush to be first, the news networks initially got it wrong.
There was a little bit of confusion about exactly what the U.S. Supreme Court is saying. As simply as you can tell us, Steve.
I'm sorry, I was reading. It's somewhat of a complicated breakdown here. It's quite a long document.
When the final ruling came down, it was sort of pandemonium. The television reporters at the Supreme Court were having a lot of difficulty because there were a number of opinions.
Meanwhile, amid the debris of 35 days of non-stop legal maneuvering, James Baker and the Bush team had to decipher the documents too.
And we read through the opinion and concluded, after reading all of them, that it was over.
In the end, 6 opinions were written for the 2 decisions. The most important dealt with federal law.
What the Supreme Court has done is say that the Florida Supreme Court violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which offers equal protection, when it allowed a hand recount to go forward in Florida without a statewide standard.
The Florida Supreme Court's decisions were unconstitutional in a 7-2 vote. 7-2 on constitutionality.
So they say it's okay if you go back and establish a recount that's legal, but they also say you don't have time to do it.
The 5-4 part of the decision simply said time has run out.
The myth has grown up that it was Bush who was rewarded by the courts, the presidency of the United States. And no, it's 7-2. 7 justices held that the Constitution was being violated by the practices the Gore campaign was insisting upon.
And at 3 minutes before 11 o'clock here in the East, just before 8 in the West, it appears now that the next president of the United States is all but signed, sealed, and delivered.
And I picked up the phone and called the governor in Austin, and that's when I got him on the line, that's when I said, congratulations, Mr. President-elect.
The fight is over, and we are told that he was planning on calling the governor probably en route
over to the old executive office building.
Just moments ago, I spoke with George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd President of the United States. And I promised him that I wouldn't call him back this time.
Al Gore and his advisors made a very responsible, statesmanlike decision by conceding and allowing the country to move on.
It was probably the most honorable step I've ever seen a politician take. It was a magnificent speech.
Tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession.
He wanted to see this country united and did what he could in his concession speech.
Vice President Gore deserves the nation's thanks for concluding that the best interests of the country were more important than his best interests.
We will stand together behind our new president.
It was universally praised as the most human, real, warm, accessible speech that Al Gore, heretofore considered robotic, had ever given.
Thank you all.
This evening I received a gracious call from the Vice President. We agreed to meet early next week in Washington, and we agreed to do our best to heal our country after this hard-fought contest.
It's a tribute to the United States that we can have a very serious internal disagreement, and in the end we're one country and one people.
Our nation must rise above a house divided.
I would get calls from former heads of state saying, "What's the matter with your country? Can't you even conduct an election?" And I said, "The system is working." And I dare say if something like this were happening in your country, you might have tanks in the streets.
We can abide even a decision as wrong, in my view, as Bush v. Gore, because we respect the rule of law. We've got to have a way to solve these problems without going to the streets.
Bush won the first count in Florida. He won the recount. News media and universities did subsequent recounts. There's never been a count that Bush didn't eventually win in Florida.
On December 18th, Electoral College representatives cast their votes for president. And on January 6, 2001, Congress tallied those votes. Vice President Gore presided. It was officially over. The country had a new president-elect.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
We continue to transfer political power peacefully, and it's one of the real strengths of our country.
So help me God.
Well, this was a very close election. Now, the 5-4 vote went along party lines. The 4 Democratic judges said, let's give them some more time. The 5 Republican judges said, no, let's not. And what was very unusual about this was they said that this decision could never be used in any other presidential elections. Now remember, this is the first time in the history of the United States that the courts has decided who the president of the United States was going to be. You can see from the election map that it was very, very close. We will never know what the George W. Bush administration would be like because of the attacks on the World Trade Centers. Muslim terrorists hijacked planes. One was plowed into the North Tower, the other was plowed into the South Tower, one was plowed into the Pentagon, and one crashed in Pennsylvania as it was approaching the Washington, D.C. airspace. Now, Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization run by Osama bin Laden, claimed responsibility. Now, I'm having some problems with this video here, so we're going to move on. The Bush administration called for the country of Afghanistan, which is where Al-Qaeda was being trained, to arrest Al-Qaeda and to turn them over to the United States. The Taliban, the people who ran Afghanistan, said no. Immediately, George W. Bush will go before Congress and ask that Congress allow him to send troops to Afghanistan to seek out and find the terrorists. Congress agreed.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down soon.
September 11th, 2001 wasn't the first time America had heard from Osama bin Laden. Since the 1998 embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania and the bombing of the USS Cole in 2000, the United States had been pressuring the Taliban regime to hand over the al-Qaeda leader, believed to be hiding out in Afghanistan, training terrorists. They did not comply.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
By November, the U.S.-backed fighting force known as the Northern Alliance had reclaimed Kabul. By December 7th, the Taliban stronghold of Kandahar had fallen.
There is no doubt that the United States thought that we had succeeded in Afghanistan, that we had Osama bin Laden on the run, that this was a war that was essentially in the bag.
With Hamid Karzai in place as the interim leader of Afghanistan, the drumbeat of war moved west to Iraq.
The conduct of the Iraqi regime is a threat to the authority of the United Nations and a threat to peace.
The problem was that he took his eye off the ball and linked two things that didn't go together, which is al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. And so things got much worse.
By October.
And so we're going to stop there with Afghanistan and move our attention to Iraq. Now in 2003, as we heard in the previous video, there was a belief that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, WMD for short. And so without capturing Osama bin Laden, without destroying al-Qaeda, the United States will send troops to Iraq. It is in this time that the army will invade Iraq, Saddam Hussein will be overthrown. Eventually he will be captured by Iraqi soldiers. Eventually he will be killed. But there were no weapons of mass destruction ever discovered.
It has been called the most unpopular war in America since Vietnam.
They died in a just cause for defending freedom, and they will not have died in vain.
Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the Iraq War. While the war in Iraq officially began in March 2003, it was decades in the making. After the Gulf War ended in 1991, the United Nations imposed sanctions that prevented Iraq from building or housing weapons of mass destruction. The United States and its allies also pressured Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein as leader. Despite these limitations, Iraq was accused of having access to a number of destructive items, including biological weapons, poison gas, and more. Following 9/11, President George W. Bush and his administration attempted disarmament efforts with renewed gusto.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Meanwhile, Iraq did not fully cooperate with UN weapons inspections. By 2002, Bush warned that Iraq would face military action should they not allow these security checks. In October 2002, the joint resolution to authorize the use of United States armed forces against Iraq was approved by the U.S. Senate, allowing Bush to legally invade Iraq as part of his war on terror.
When I say we will lead a coalition of the willing to disarm him if he chooses not to disarm, I mean it.
The U.S. also claimed an interest in installing a democratic regime in Iraq. However, fellow NATO members France, Germany, and Canada, in addition to Russia, were all against an invasion of Iraq, and instead wanted to disarm the country through diplomatic negotiations. Meanwhile, the U.S. and Tony Blair's United Kingdom pushed ahead with their plans. On March 20, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom began. Almost 250,000 American soldiers fought beside 45,000 British soldiers and more troops from a variety of other nations. With this invasion, the US and UK hoped to end the Hussein regime, eliminate WMDs, remove radical Islamists, and give humanitarian aid wherever possible. They also hoped to take control of Iraqi oil and to install a model democratic government. On April 9th, the US-led coalition took the city of Baghdad, and this signaled the end of Saddam Hussein's reign. A transitional government was then put into place. The Coalition Provisional Authority stayed in office until mid-2004 and held power over the government of Iraq. By May 2003, Bush considered the war a mission accomplished and declared victory despite the fact Saddam Hussein had not yet been captured.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Insurgent and guerrilla attacks increased following that speech and caused a number of U.S. military deaths. Efforts were then increased to catch former government leaders. Saddam Hussein's sons were killed, and many important people were captured. Saddam himself was finally taken at the end of 2003, and this signaled an improvement in conditions as insurgent attacks briefly decreased. Unfortunately, by the spring of 2004, not only did insurgency resume, it also intensified.
The main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering in Iraq.
Violent battles, like the first and second battles of Fallujah, resulted in civilian, police, and U.S. military deaths. Meanwhile, support at home and abroad waned, as it was revealed that the U.S. military was abusing prisoners at Abu Ghraib. In fact, this turned out to be a defining moment of the war. Fighting, insurgency, IEDs, and suicide bombings continued over the next years. After a general election at the end of 2005, Iraq's permanent government took control in May 2006. Shortly thereafter, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq was located and killed. At the end of 2006, amid reports that suggested the situation in Iraq was not progressing, Saddam Hussein's death sentence was carried out after he was found guilty of crimes against humanity. By 2007, the U.S. began employing a surge strategy and deployed more troops. Meanwhile, allies began withdrawing their forces. The next year, things stabilized and fatalities dropped significantly. 2008 also saw the approval of the U.S.-Iraq Status of Forces Agreement. Most importantly, this deal meant American troops would be removed from Iraq by the end of 2011. An exit strategy was presented in 2009, and in October 2011, President Barack Obama pledged the American presence would end as promised.
As of January 1st, and in keeping with our strategic framework agreement with Iraq, it will be a normal relationship between sovereign nations, an equal partnership based on mutual interest and mutual respect.
Meanwhile, the restrictions placed on Iraq in the 1990s were lifted by the UN, and this gave the Iraqi government control of the country's oil. Since it began, the Iraq War cost American taxpayers trillions of dollars and took countless soldier and civilian lives. It ultimately became one of the longest and most divisive battles in U.S. history.
Now, even though President Obama said that our troops would be out of Iraq, they are still there today. President Trump promised he would take them out of Iraq. They are still there today. President Obama said he would take all troops out of Afghanistan. He didn't. President Trump said he would take all troops out of Afghanistan. He has not. In 2004, it is a presidential election. The Democrats are going to turn to John Kerry. John Kerry had been a war hero during the Vietnam War. The Republicans will choose George W. Bush. Again, as in the 2000 election, President Bush will win a squeaker of an election. Bush's second term was mired by a war in which it seemed like we could not gain enough of an upper hand to pull out. Every time it looked like the United States was going to pull troops out of either Afghanistan or Iraq, terrorist actions would occur. Now, these 8 years of war, plus a let's not worry about what banks are doing, plus all other financial shenanigans, brought about a recession. The recession of 2008 was one of the worst recessions we have ever had in American history. The stock market is going to tank. To solve the problem, Congress proposed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP for short. The idea was that these banks, which had loaned out the money, are too big to fail. Let's try that again. I don't know why we're having problems with this.
2008 was a year that many investors around the world will want to forget. With plunging home prices and rising foreclosures, the housing problem snowballed into an economic crisis that we haven't seen since the Great Depression, spreading across the globe. Power Lunch takes a look back after the fall of Lehman and when the government stepped in just before a near total collapse of the financial system.
What we are working on now is an approach to deal with the systemic risk and the stresses in our capital markets.
The federal government should interfere in the marketplace only when necessary. Given the precarious state of today's financial markets and their vital importance to the daily life.
Now, before it goes on, they have the dates. Remember, this is an election year. November 7th will be the date of the presidential election.
Of the American people. Government intervention is not only warranted, it is essential.
We have gotten closer to where we think it ought to be, starting from what they sent us. We're not quite there yet. We are going to continue to work on it.
And we are not sending a blank check to Wall Street.
The government has given us a lifeline. We appreciate the fact that they've done it. We want to repay that loan just as quickly as we can.
This is not a handout to individual institutions. This is trying to make the market as a whole work.
I'm frustrated. The taxpayer is on the hook. The taxpayer is already on the hook. The taxpayer already is going to suffer the consequences if things don't work the way they should work.
We're in the midst of a serious financial crisis, and the federal government is responding with decisive action.
We've experienced significant turmoil in our financial markets in the last few days, including the collapse of Washington Mutual and Wachovia here, and the failure of two major financial institutions in Europe.
Anyone who watched CNBC's coverage saw a direct juxtaposition. One half of the screen showed this House floor. The other half of the screen showed the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. With each new no vote, the Dow lost points and greater panic spread throughout the trading floor.
This is a pain that will stay with me for the rest of my life.
The federal government will use a portion of the $700 billion financial rescue plan to inject capital into banks by purchasing equity shares. This new capital will help healthy banks continue making loans to businesses and consumers.
Today's actions are not what we ever wanted to do, but today's actions are what we must do to restore confidence in our financial system.
Now, it's important to remember that this was more of a tourniquet on a severe wound. The recession of 2008 continued and will become a major player in the election of 2008. Well, this is the end of today's work. A reminder that you have until 11:59 to turn in your work.